This video is going to just be me talking with some unrelated gameplay of Xenoblade X on the screen. You're not going to get anything additional out of this video from watching it as opposed to just listening to it, so feel free to tab off and just listen to me. Also, massive spoiler through the end of the game. We know that the White Whale was not the only arc ship to launch from Earth prior to its destruction in Xenoblade X, so let's try and just talk about some of the other places that could have launched ships, and what some of the new cities they could carry would be. First off, we need to establish a lot of stuff. We don't know how big the arc ships are. I'm not going to say, oh, we'll just compare the White Whale directly to the Eldridge, because the Eldridge was a ship from millennia after humanity started becoming a big space power, while the White Whale was the first interstellar ship humans as a race made alongside all the other arcs. So we don't know how big they are, we don't know logistically how they would work, but it is implied that there were a few different designs, though it seems that all of them were built and launched from the surface of the Earth, as opposed to being built in orbit, which is the more efficient and cost-effective way to make a giant spaceship like this, although, to be fair, they had aliens fighting around Earth, so that probably wasn't as safe in terms of people not being dead. We're also going to acknowledge the fact that in about the year 2024, Elma showed up and gave humanity a bunch of futuristic technology. Skells, really good power sources, and a faster-than-light space engine. We can handwave all the technological development needed in making interstellar-capable massive spacecraft, because let's be real, that's not going to actually happen in the next 35 years. We will be going on the assumption, though, that whenever possible, people would try to launch from places that were historically spaceports, as in active spaceports in the year 2019. It also seems that the majority of world leaders and world governments were convinced of the alien threat, and they managed to work together and share the tech so that everyone had a decent chance of escaping. This is very unrealistic, I don't think I need to explain that much more, but I'm guessing this means Elma went to the United Nations, the majority of UN leaders, or the leaders of UN countries, agreed that yes, this is a problem, let's try to share this technology, give everyone a chance of escaping. And this would mean that wealth and technology inequality between countries probably decreased a lot more quickly than would or will happen in the real world because of this. So I'm going to go mostly off of real world stuff, like countries that have active and increasing in spending space programs now. But keep in mind that getting this much tech and getting this incentive to increase your spending and development of a space program would probably mean everyone capable of making a space program would be making a space program. So probably, as long as there were enough rich people in a country to buy seats on an arc ship, because yeah, international cooperation and extreme globalization happened against all odds, but classism, that was definitely still a thing. The majority of people on the White Whale were either military or rich people who basically paid to get their seats, or government people who probably also had a high amount of intersection with military and rich people, so that kind of thing, very much still a thing. So any country that had enough rich people would probably be able to get an arc ship. We're just going to talk about the ones from people with existing space programs. It's also heavily implied that there were multiple projects made to escape Earth. Some used actual people in stasis on their ships. Elma estimates 50,000 as a maximum amount on those, as well as others who went the same model as the White Whale and used a quantum computer to store a lot of consciousnesses, which the White Whale had 20 million. I misspoke and said 20,000 and only realized this when editing, so we'll be using that as a benchmark. You'd need a lot of ships to get the whole world population out. And again, we know that it was mostly rich people who got on the White Whale, which suggests that a large percentage of the human population just didn't even get a chance on a ship. Not even a ship that got shot down. They just died with the Earth, were never loaded on a ship whatsoever. So we're not even going to be pretending that there were enough ships made to store all of humanity. It was probably very much a 1%er thing before the ghosts started shooting people down and blowing them all up. Different governments would probably favor different methods. I could definitely see smaller countries being able to load their entire populations, or their entire populations being able to pay for it, on a stasis spaceship. Tax haven microstates could probably just put almost everyone living on them on a ship and be like, this is new our country. It's not new main city in our country or major city in our country or capital of our country. This entire ship is our country. And also, Vatican City is definitely smaller than NLA, even as it is in its shrunken based on actual size in-game. So, just imagine uprooting all of Vatican City, putting it on a spaceship, and bam, Space Pope. That's definitely a thing that would happen. I could also see, just in general, important sites for culture or history or that sort, just of humanity in general or a specific country, being taken and placed in an ark ship to try and preserve as much of human culture and stuff as possible. Although I guess you could have VR recreations of important locations. The Library of Congress seems to have been completely digitized and not physically taken, at least on the White Whale, so I'm not entirely sure about that, but I mean, the Vatican City, it's a country, and it's an important historical, cultural, and religious location, so you might as well take that entire thing. Also, my futurist brain went off, and I figured, hey, if small island nations are losing territory because of climate change and rising sea levels, if they start making their ark ship, what if they make the city part first, and as people lose their homes to rising sea levels, they move on to the city part of the ark ship, so you've got a floating city encompassing your country before you've got a spaceship taking your country off into space. So that kind of makes sense too. I'm mainly going to focus on countries that have launched satellites already or are capable of doing so, or are planning on increasing their space programs in the near future, just because I gotta make this short somehow. Plenty of countries are in the process of developing their space programs. Some have tried and failed to launch satellites so far, and these programs would probably be jump-started and make successful launches very quickly after ELMA arrived in 2024, because you got a lot of incentive to go to space if you're gonna die if you don't go to space. A lot of countries don't have to worry about the lack of spaceport on their own soil, though, because quantum computer ships would never have to have the passengers physically go near the ship at all. They just digitize their mind, it gets uploaded into the computer, and then I guess you could email a person halfway across the world. So poorer countries would probably go stasis, smaller countries would probably go stasis. That's really all I can think of. So if I'm going to say, oh yes, this country has no active spaceports anywhere near its population centers, don't worry, they probably just quantum computer launch from that space center, and there we go. So let's go for countries that definitely launch ships first. The first is obviously the USA. This will get the most attention because I'm American and know the most about it. We obviously know the US launched stuff because NLA exists. And it's also very possible to guess where the White Whale was launched from. Vandenberg Air Force Base has never launched humans, but it's launched satellites and missiles before, and it's actually located pretty close to actual Los Angeles. Edwards Air Force Base is even closer and has a runway that was used for certain space shuttle landings, but it's never launched anything, though it's also a possibility. Keep in mind, I'm saying they would use spaceports because they would already sort of have infrastructure to support this stuff. It doesn't really matter if you destroy a nearby settlement on your launch pad as you launch your city into space, because again, Earth is going to be destroyed. They don't really have to worry about collateral in this context. Now, every spacecraft the US has ever launched with humans on it came out of Kennedy Space Center in Florida, which makes the most probable second city to get a US ark ship actually New Orlando, of all things, just because that is a major city very, very near to the Space Center. The US is a big country with a relatively even population distribution for its size, so a lot of other main cities in other regions of the country probably had ships as well. And also, high amounts of rich people means high demand for spots on a ship. And a large military. Didn't think of that until just now. A new DC is also fairly likely, preserving the president and Congress, and I guess the Supreme Court too, at the time Earth was lost, as well as the US being pretty religious when it comes to its major documents, so they probably also took things like the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, even if they didn't uproot, say, the entire Capitol building or White House. Other populous cities probably also got something, even if it didn't launch from anywhere near there. New York City is the only one more populous than LA, so it probably existed. Chicago and Houston are also large and very far from the other major cities that I've talked about so far, so there are also possibilities. There is the Johnson Space Center in Houston, but that is more used for astronaut training and grounded experiments and mission control. It doesn't really launch stuff, so they could obviously retrofit it, and they already have NASA land there, so that's a possibility, but it's not one that's actively used for launches now. I don't know about Alaska, Hawaii, and the territories, as well as all the other random stuff the US owns outside of the lower 48. I don't really know about that. Alaska has a very small population, and it's also very far from the equator, so if it wanted to launch a stasis ship, it's a very unoptimal place geographically to launch from. There are a few missile bases out in the Pacific that could be used, and like Puerto Rico is close to the equator, so it's a decent place to launch something from. So, I don't know. That's just more conjecture stuff. Moving on to Japan, though, NLA received communications in both French and Japanese from other ARK ships, suggesting that a Japanese-speaking one and a French-speaking one both survived the destruction of Earth. Japan already has a prolific space program. Its main launch facility, where an ARK is most likely to have been launched, is Tanegashima Space Center, which is located nowhere near Tokyo, but concept art showed that the city in the actual game was originally supposed to be New Tokyo, so I'm guessing that the one on the ship was New Tokyo. That's the headcanon that makes the most sense for me, because it's Xeno. They like putting Easter eggs to stuff in, so an Easter egg to the concept phase of this game is very up their alley. Other cities might have had their own ships too, but they probably all launched from Tanegashima or the nearby Uchinora Space Center, just because those are the big two it has, and they're also the southernmost, so closest to the equator. I didn't mention it before, but you'll want to launch your rockets from near the equator and going east, because that gives them the most momentum boost from the rotation of the Earth itself, which means it's easier to get into orbit. Now, the French one is a lot more difficult to pin down, because more than one country has French as a major language. So we're just going to focus on France itself, just because, again, we'd be here forever if I talked about all the French-speaking countries. France does have its own space program, but it mainly participates in the European Space Agency. Now, the European Space Agency is a space agency which is a collaboration between a bunch of European countries. It is not, however, related directly to the European Union. They have cooperations with each other, and EU space laws affect the ESA and that stuff, but there are non-EU members in the ESA, EU members that are not in the ESA. They're not directly connected to each other. I didn't know this. My original thought was, oh, the French thing was a European Union spacecraft, and they got so salty after Brexit that they just removed English as an official language and stuck mainly with French. Turns out the European Space Agency uses English, French, and German anyway, so could still be an ESA ship, but it could also just be a French ship. France has its own space program, and it's very possible that different nations in the ESA worked together to design their ships, but launched it under their own country's flag. It almost certainly launched from Guiana Space Center in French Guiana. France has a piece of itself in South America on the East Coast near the equator. It's a very, very good space to launch rockets from. The city is most likely New Paris because rich people, but if the naming was based on proximity, New Cayenne would actually be possible too. I would guess that a lot of countries that participate in the ESA would launch from there as well, just because it is such a good place to launch spacecraft from, geographically speaking. In Europe itself, you've got land to the east of you, and you got nowhere near the equator, so if France is like, yo, want to launch from South America, you're probably going to launch from South America, let's be real. Some other countries that are likely to have ARKs that aren't explicitly mentioned, obviously Russia. It's Russia in space travel. I don't know if more needs to be said. The former Soviet countries are the only ones with a longer history of human spaceflight than the US, and Russia inherited the Soviet space program once the USSR broke up. Its main spaceport is the Baikonur Cosmodrome, which even Americans and NASA-associated foreign astronauts have been launching from. on Russian rockets since the space shuttle program ended. That's probably going to stop like next year though, because we're putting more US rockets up. This is actually in Kazakhstan because Soviet Union, but in recent years, a couple new cosmodromes have been made on Russian soil in order to alleviate the pressure there, and probably also to be like, hey, Russians are launching from Russian soil. How about that? There are no major cities near any of them. Obviously, there are no major Russian cities in Kazakhstan, so that's out of the picture. But even the Russian ones are far from major Russian cities. So again, probably just the biggest ones. Moscow, St. Petersburg, you know the drill. China is the only country besides the US and the USSR/Russia to operate human launch vehicles, so they're probably up there. It's also currently developing its space program a lot. It's got the second highest spending on its program out of any country in the world, behind the US. It's almost a third as much as the US spending, so they're really getting up there, yee. They're planning for a space station, they're planning on sending humans to the moon in the 2020s, and they've got a few possible launch sites. There's also India. India's launched a few satellites. It's gearing up to send humans into orbit, launch its own space station. Its biggest spaceport, I'm going to butcher this, is the Satish Dhawan Space Center, which would make Chennai the nearest large city. If we're going proximity-based for new cities, that's probably the one that would take. The British Commonwealth, I should probably not be lumping this together at all. I don't really have much to say about it, other than Australia and New Zealand both have multiple places that have been used to launch rockets, mainly weaponized missiles, in the past, and one active spaceport each in the present day. So depending on how connected the Commonwealth still is by 2054, other countries with worse geography for launches might be offered use of Australia and or New Zealand to launch their rockets. I was thinking just countries in the British Commonwealth, but hey, if everyone in the world is being a lot more friendly, then maybe the Australians and New Zealanders were just like, yo, launch your ark ship from here. Also keep in mind, the UK is in the European Space Agency, so they themselves probably would be launching from French Guiana. Argentina has launched some rockets before. It's collaborated with Brazil and is working on its first orbital flight at the present moment. Speaking of Brazil, it's launched a few suborbital flights from its two spaceports, but its most recent launch was via French Guiana. This is what I'm saying. Space travel, even when it comes to governments, is an extremely collaborative thing. So you'll find people launching satellites from completely random places you wouldn't expect, and countries you wouldn't expect to be collaborating. So there's really no way of saying exactly, yes, this country on its own launched this ark ship from this spaceport that it and only it operates. It's just not a thing. Lastly, I'm going to talk about the African Union, which is a thing. People are surprised about that. Every country on the continent of Africa, and I think most of the island nations surrounding it, is actually a member of the African Union. And Africa, perhaps unsurprisingly, is the only continent without a currently operating spaceport. However, the African Union is getting ready to enter the field of space travel. Legislation has been passed in the past few years to establish its own space agency. Egypt was chosen to host it this year, and by 2054, even without the intervention of ELMA, it's very likely to be in full swing and operating its own missions and its own launches, probably having its own astronauts. Again, Africa is one of those continents that has a lot of it on the equator, so you got a lot of places to launch rockets from. And I think France especially has launched missiles from its former colonies in Africa before, so it's been done. But that's the end of this video, really. In case you can't tell, I kind of let this topic get away from me, like really away from me, just because I went down a few research rabbit holes, so yeah, probably not my finest work, but not every video I make has to be my finest work. I'm very much coming to terms on that. Also, if you're not from the US, even if you're from another country that I did mention, what do you think your country's new city thing would be? What city would be the most likely to get a new iteration on an ark ship? I would like to know. Yeah, I don't really know. I've been kind of out of it this week, so not doing too great at communicating this time. Goodbye.